Department is now renewing its warning for Americans not to travel to Mexico because of a rise in violent crime.
And Eyewitness News reporter Sophie Flay has more on the travel warning that comes just before the start of the busy spring break season.
The State Department has issued a travel warning advising Americans to avoid Playa del Carmen in Mexico.
This morning as spring break heats up and crowds start to head out for that idyllic beach getaway. Texas authorities are issuing an urgent warning against travel to Mexico.
Every year, right before spring break, the U.S. government announces official travel warnings for Mexico. The television announcers highlight recent murders and kidnappings and cite statistics that leave the viewer with the impression that Mexico is the most dangerous place in the world. But over the years, I've grown to become skeptical of what the man on the TV has to say, as they often share part of the story and leave out the rest, most often to propagate an underlying agenda. In 2023, the president of Mexico, AMLO, addressed the anti-Mexican rhetoric coming from the U.S., and the president of Mexico had this to say. U.S. government alerts say that it is safe to only travel to Campeche and Yucatan. If that were the case, so many Americans wouldn't be coming to live in Mexico City and the rest of the country. So what's happening? Why the paranoia? Does the president of Mexico have a point? Is Mexico really safe? Let's take a look at some data and see what's going on. As the US media often highlights the murders that take place in Mexico, let's focus on the murder rate of a popular destination in Mexico, Mexico City, and how it compares to some major US cities. In 2021, Mexico City's murder rate per 100,000 people was 10.9. In that same year, Portland, Oregon had a rate of 12.9. Dallas, Texas was 14.6. Minneapolis was 22.1. And some of the worst murder rates in the United States were Baltimore at 57.5 and St. Louis was 65.3. But then we must take a look at some of the worst places in Mexico and see what their homicide rate was. These rates are pretty horrific. Zamora at 196, Zacatecas 107, Tijuana 103, to name a few. I come from the town of Salinas, California, and Salinas has a history of being a dangerous city. I have personally witnessed shootings literally happening outside of my home. I remember when I told friends that I was planning on moving to Mexico, and they would say, "Dude, aren't you scared of the violence?" I would reply and say, "Dude, look where we live. It's not much better, and maybe in some ways, it's worse." Now, not every crime is murder, and if you're not involved in the drug trade, then chances are you're probably not going to be murdered in Mexico or the United States. So another metric to consider is the crime index of a city. The crime index score represents how citizens feel about crime and safety in their city. Let's take a look at the website, Numbeo. The nearest city where I live is Puerto Vallarta. Puerto Vallarta received a crime index score of 35.7 and a safety index score of 64.3. These are good scores. The main issues that the citizens of Puerto Vallarta have are that they've seen an increase in crime, theft, and there's a problem with corruption and bribery. But in general, the residents of Puerto Vallarta feel very safe. Now let's compare this with the city that I used to live in, Portland, Oregon. The people of Portland said that they are worried about having things stolen from their car, vandalism and theft, and witnessing people openly using drugs. Overall, when comparing Portland to Puerto Vallarta, people generally feel safer in Puerto Vallarta than Portland. It is unfortunate what the government has allowed to transpire in such a beautiful city as Portland. So what if we flip the perspective? Should Mexicans be worried about traveling to the United States? Speaking with Mexican friends who are traveling to the US, they often consider things like mass shootings, serial killers, and random attacks from thugs. A lot of this they see on social media or even on Netflix series about serial killers. On a personal note, I recently traveled to Orlando, Florida for work. In the recent months prior to this trip, there's been a lot of rumors of wars between the US and other countries, and it actually made me consider what I would do if something crazy happened while I was out on my trip. Thankfully, nothing happened. But going back to Mexico, I wasn't worried about this at all. Mexico is a fairly neutral country. There's not a lot of concern of suddenly finding yourself in the middle of a war between nations in Mexico. Whether you're traveling in the US or Mexico, the degree of danger changes drastically depending on what city or state you're going to. When Mexicans travel to the US, they don't plan their trip to the Grand Canyon and worry about what's going on in Baltimore. In the same sense, people traveling to Puerto Vallarta shouldn't be worried about what's going on in Juarez. I can't help but suspect that the timing of the travel warnings from the US government are driven mostly by the desire to retain tourism revenue within the United States rather than Mexico. When it comes to your personal safety, don't just take my word for it. Do your own research when traveling anywhere in the world. Now, I want to hear your comments below. Do you feel safe when traveling to Mexico? I've lived in Mexico since 2016, and I'm happy that I can tell you that I feel safe. I think the biggest risk for US tourists traveling to Mexico is theft, corrupt cops with their bribes, and scams. I recently did a video showcasing real scams that take place here in Mexico. You can watch that video right here. Thank you for watching today's video. Please like this video, share with a friend, and subscribe to the channel. De mi familia a la tuya, Dios te bendiga.